Welcome back, it is Chris Nichols, and no, I don't have an adorable PETA nickname for you today because some of you, not all of you, have been very immature children about it. So fortunately, my pedagogical abilities are exceptional if I do say so myself. So instead, let's go right to the video where we talk about the Nikon Z8 versus the Sony a7R V. Cue the intro. What's wrong, Jordan?
I've been using this camera to record the podcast. It's overheating every time. I'm just gonna like throw it in the river or give it to a pawn shop or something like that.
Okay, well, don't throw it in the river because I want to fish in that river, okay? And don't take it to a pawn shop because there's something so much better.
What?
Yeah, KEH.com.
Who?
KEH.com.
Who?
They're our preferred, trusted seller and buyer of used gear. You're going to get treated fairly, you're going to get a fair price, and you're going to get paid quickly. As well, if you find another camera that you like that they offer, you could trade in your camera, get a 10% trade-in bonus on that price. The fact of the matter is they've got experts that are going to check over everything. There's no hassles. You get warranty. I mean, it's definitely the way to go. Do you remember who it was?
KEH.com.
Hey, KEH.com. So why are we comparing these two cameras? Well, first off, they are very similar sizes, both full frame cameras, very similar price points, and they're also, very capable cameras, very professional cameras, but they're not what I would say are the top tier cameras in the respective lineups. But there are some notable differences, and that's why I want to do this comparison. Now, the Sony a7R V, I've said already, is my favorite Sony camera that I've used to date, and personally a camera that I would really enjoy taking photographs with. But the Nikon Z8, I'm now going to go ahead and say is my favorite Nikon camera that I've ever used. All right, come on, you two, let's get this showdown started. Okay, so let's kick things off talking about body design, handling, menus, controls, batteries, that kind of stuff. We'll start with the Sony a7R V. Now, this is a slightly smaller body than the Nikon Z8, a little smaller grip as well, and I personally prefer that. I have smaller hands. I find this to be very comfortable. But I can see how some people might want something a little bit more substantial to hold on to. Now, one thing that does kind of throw me off here is the dials. We got mode dial here, which is a press to unlock, but then we got another control dial over here, which is a push in or push out toggle lock switch. I don't know why they didn't do the same on both dials. That would make more sense logically, and I find that confusing sometimes when I'm shooting. Otherwise, though, I like the controls. I like the autofocusing joystick. I like the fact that I've got my ISO and controls right on the joypad back here as opposed to on the top of the camera, and I do feel like it has a nice control structure. Now, as far as menus go, I think the Sony menus have been much improved. It's subjective which one you're going to like better or not. Now, the Sony a7R V is weather sealed. It's fairly rugged, maybe not to the same standard as their top cameras that are available, but it is durable enough. I do love the battery here because we get this Sony Z-type battery, and this thing lasts a long time. For such a small battery profile in a small camera, these actually do give you a lot of staying power. So now let's talk about the Nikon Z8 body. Now, this is definitely a heavier, larger body. That is something to be considered. The grip is bigger. Some of you are going to like that. But I do enjoy that Nikon has made more use of that extra real estate they've got by giving us well-spaced buttons, lots of customizability, nice controls, and it is a very functional camera. I do find the autofocus selector switch is functional, maybe a little bit smaller. I prefer the one on the Sony, but otherwise, menus, very subjective. I think the menus in here are perfectly fine as well. I love that we have that autofocus control, though. I think that's something Nikon's done really well. Now, this bigger, larger body does certainly feel durable and rugged, and it looks the part as well, but it's weather sealed to a similar standard as the Sony a7R V, which is to say it's not as rugged as, say, the Z9, the top tier camera, but still very usable in a lot of situations. Battery life, though, I'm going to give the edge to the Sony just because these ENEL15Cs, although ubiquitous amongst Nikon users, don't give you quite the same lifespan. I mean, I get through a half a day of serious shooting, but I absolutely want to have a lot of extras here, whereas with the Sony, I could comfortably probably get through a day of shooting with just one battery. I do also want to point out, though, that I really like the fact that we've got twin USB ports on here. So one for power delivery rated charging, but another one so you can still use accessories at the same time. I think that's a really smart move. And again, we've got the space to do those kind of things. So who's the winner? Well, this is a really tough one because they both have a lot going for them. I would say the Nikon Z8 is actually probably the more approachable camera, a little bit nicer control structure. Menus are easy to navigate, and I do like all the extra space that we have there. But after a long argument with Jordan, I'm actually going to give the win to the Sony a7R V because this is my opinion, and I'm using these cameras here. I just prefer the better battery life on the a7R V. I like the smaller, lighter body, and the controls, while they do have some minor annoyances, you get used to them. Otherwise, they are very functional. Now, of course, one of the most important things on a camera is your eye to the world through your compositions, and that's going to be your LCD panel and your EVF. The Sony a7R V, first off with its LCD panel, 2.1 million dots, could be brighter, yes, but it does have really nice articulation. Not only does it fully articulate, but it also has this hinge mechanism to pop it open, and that gets you well clear of any cables that might get in the way. It also gets you a little bit nicer waist level viewfinder shooting, so that's a really smart idea, and it really doesn't take up much space. Of course, another big feature here is the 9.44 million dot EVF here. Now, that is an incredibly huge number, and to be fair, when you are shooting like burst rates and when you're autofocusing continuously, that resolution can drop, but regardless, it is still very high. And one big advantage that I really like when I'm actually reviewing my photos in playback with those 60 megapixel files, you really can zoom in and make sure that everything's sharp and crisp. Okay, so what about the Nikon Z8? Well, first off, starting off with the back panel, 2.2 million dots, but it's also nice and bright. It's really nice to use. And this also has very good articulation. I mean, you can see the hinge there. I can swing the camera. I can get it away from the eyepiece. Really, really nice for top-down shooting or above a crowd shooting. The only disadvantage, though, compared to the Sony is, although it doesn't get in the way of your cables, you can't shoot yourself if you're doing any vlogging or self-portraiture. So that's a knock against it. Now, what about the EVF? Well, 3.69 million dots. And do I wish it was higher? Sure. I mean, given that this is a 45 megapixel sensor in this camera, I do wish that I had just more dots to really be able to zoom in and see detail and double check stuff. I will say, though, that this is probably the most lag-free EVF I've ever used, and for sports and action, that does make a lot of sense. But I'm still going to give the win to the Sony a7R V because the fact of the matter is we've got better articulation on the back panel here. The EVF, although it does drop in resolution, is still going to be way higher than what the Nikon can do. And, you know, there's just no replacement for displacement, baby.
What does that mean?
It means it's bigger, more better. Let's talk about autofocus next, because if your camera can't focus properly, there's no point doing photography. So, the Sony first. Now, the a7R V is the first camera to feature Sony's new AI module, which helps with its autofocusing capabilities and subject detection. No, it's not artificially intelligent, but yes, the results speak for themselves here. Real-time tracking is easy to use and it's very accurate. I find the a7R V is pretty much always on the iris, never on the eyelashes, and although there's situations where it might mess up autofocus, it seems to be the easiest to just shoot out of the box with success. You don't have to customize much if you don't want to. You don't have to babysit it if you don't want to. It just seems to work well. But what about the Nikon Z8? I mean, this has really stepped up the game in autofocus terms as well. This now has airplane detection. Nikon's automatic choosing of subject detection does work very effectively, and I found a noticeable improvement in this camera's eye detect capabilities for portraits. But there are still some inconsistencies. I still do find that sometimes they get a bit more eyelash than iris, and I also find that in situations like rain or heavy snow, the consistency of the autofocus can start to drop. But overall, this is a very good performer. Okay, so I'm not going to draw the win out here. It's the Sony. You probably guessed it. I mean, Sony have been the gold standard for autofocusing other cameras are trying to achieve for years now, and they seem to just be really good at holding on to that crown. I do like the Z8. I honestly feel like it focuses better than the Z9, which makes absolutely no sense, but nothing focuses as good as a Sony a7R V. Let's talk about lens selection next, because you need to have the right glass in your repertoire to cover the work that you want to do. Starting with Sony, I mean, the a7R V is part of the full-frame Sony E-mount, and this has tons of lenses available. First, let's talk, though, original manufacturer. Although Sony started out with some lenses that are questionable as far as image quality goes, they've done a great job of updating their lineup in the last few years, and they have awesome professional and affordable lenses for this camera system. Great telephotos, great professional zooms, lots of nice primes, lots of affordable portrait lenses, but of course, the card up their sleeve is also the fact they've got great third-party support. I mean, everybody is making lenses for Sony E-mount, Sigma, Tamron, lots of boutique manufacturers, and really, it's just a great system when you want to have as much glass as possible. So when it comes to the Nikon Z8, when we talk about original manufacturer lenses, honestly, all the full-frame Z-mount lenses Nikon have made are either decent or exceptional. I mean, I love their professional zoom lenses. I mean, they're sharp, they're beautiful. I love their telephoto lenses for sports and wildlife. They're ultra-wides. I mean, really, it's all been great. But it's not just their expensive professional lenses. I mean, they've been really smart about outsourcing a lot of budget Pro 2.8 lenses. And that's actually been really successful as well. And they are much more open to allowing other manufacturers to then use their lens mount. So you've got Sigma making APS-C. Hopefully we'll see some full frame stuff coming out here pretty soon, and other third-party manufacturers making lenses for the mount. But it's really smart, and it's a good step in the right direction. And of course, the only reason I'm going to give the win to the Sony a7R V is because Sony was making those good steps in the right direction many, many years before. It's as simple as that.
Hey, it's Jordan, the other one, to talk about the video capabilities of these cameras. Let's start with the Sony a7R V. Now, if you're looking at the spec list on this camera, it looks like an incredibly impressive video camera. We've got 8K recording, 4K 60 as an option, but the big limitation here is this 60 megapixel sensor, which is quite slow to read out. So that 8K recording does have a crop and very bad rolling shutter, or you're gonna have to go into the Super 35 mode, which still has some rolling shutter issues if you want oversampled high quality video. And it's a real shame because this has some great features on it. The fully articulating screen that you can pull out from the body is my favorite design I've seen on a camera yet. We've got some great options like the focus map, breathing compensation, but they're all applied to a camera that really shouldn't be designed for video in the first place. But the Nikon Z8 has quickly become one of my favorite video cameras that I've ever used. Here, if we're recording the 8K video, we get the full width of the sensor. We can record internal RAW. Somehow they won a lawsuit with Red, so you've got the ability to record a variety of internal RAW formats. It does very nice 4K 60 oversampled, and you've even got the option of 4K 120, although the quality does dip a little bit there. So I could absolutely use the Sony for odd video jobs, but it's not something that I would pick up as a dedicated video camera, where the Nikon Z8 is one of the best video cameras ever made. No contest, this is the better option for video.
All right, where was I? Image quality, let's talk about that next. So, Sony a7R V, of course, this has the higher megapixel sensor, 60 megapixel full frame sensor, but on top of that, it has excellent low light performance, fantastic dynamic range, and its only real weakness when it comes to image quality is its pretty poor rolling shutter when you're shooting electronic shutter mode. But now let's talk about the Nikon Z8, because this actually has a more sophisticated sensor in my opinion. Now, first off, I love 60 megapixels, but I will be the first to admit I would rarely need that many megapixels. 45, I think, definitely suits a lot more people. It's a better sweet spot. But on top of that, this is a stacked chip, and that has some serious benefits. We're going to talk about that in just a bit. However, this is also an electronic shutter only camera. And yes, there are some issues as far as losing a little bit of dynamic range, which would also mean your shadow noise. You know, in comparison to the Sony, I would say this is going to be a little bit worse when it comes to dynamic range. And of course, we are giving up 15 megapixels, but this sensor is still fantastic for most people. So then which way do we go? I mean, first off, honestly, I consider the image quality differences here to be the least important of all the categories we're talking about, because both cameras take great shots and the differences optically are going to be incredibly minor. But if we have to pick a winner, I got to give it to the Sony, because yeah, we're getting 15 more megapixels here. We're getting more dynamic range here. We're getting basically the same low light performance, which is exceptionally good, but 15 more megapixels here at the same time. So yeah, the Sony is on a technical level a little bit better. So now let's talk about burst rates here on the Sony a7R V. Now this camera can shoot 10 frames per second, but that's really only if you're shooting JPEG or lossy compressed formats. You know, in a more practical sense, if we're talking about uncompressed or lossless compressed RAW files, you're looking at about 6 frames per second, which is fine for casual shooting, but not really where you want to be for high-end sports or action. I do, however, really like that Sony does give you this really nice integrated CF Express A/SD card slot system, and it gives you 2 of those. Now this gives you a lot of benefits. First off, you have affordable SD media, but you can also get CF Express A when you want to clear your buffer quicker in action scenarios. More importantly, the fact that they're both exactly the same speed means you get that double redundancy if you want to do backups, proxy files. I mean, this is a really smart setup. But what about burst rates on the Nikon Z8? Well, thanks to its stacked sensor that has no rolling shutter issues and its electronic shutter only design, this camera can absolutely shoot very fast burst rates. So first off, full resolution JPEGs, 30 frames per second. I mean, that's crazy. But even in lossless compressed RAW formats, you're going to get 20 frames per second. And if you want an even longer buffer, you can go to high efficiency compressed, where you basically have minimal quality loss, but it'll go as long as you really want it to go, over 1,000 shots. I mean, that makes this camera ideal for sports, action, wildlife. It will not stop on you. The only downside is when it comes to media, we do have a CF Express Type B slot. That's the fast one, but our backup is SD only, and it's much slower. So you don't get that speed along with double redundancy. So when it comes to burst rates, we got an easy win here for the Nikon Z8. I mean, the A7R5 can't touch it, and if you want to get something similar in the Sony lineup, you have to go to the much more expensive A1. So if you've been keeping a tally, clearly the Sony a7R5 has won far more of the categories, but we have to keep things in context here. I mean, first off, although these cameras are similar prices and sizes, they actually have very different purposes, and I think that's really important to understand. I mean, the Nikon Z8 is absolutely the more versatile camera. It's made for shooting sports and action and wildlife, as well as landscape or as a hybrid camera. This is far more versatile. The Sony a7R5 does have some better technology, especially in terms of autofocus and maybe image quality, but this is really intended more as an art camera, studio camera, landscape camera. I mean, something where you really need those extra megapixels and focusing capabilities. I think the other thing we need to keep in mind as well is that when the Sony did win in a category, it won by a small margin, but when the Nikon Z8 wins in its categories, it wins in a really big way. So for me personally, I would probably still take the a7R5. You know, if I'm doing my own work, I don't typically shoot a lot of wildlife or sports or action. I would want the higher image quality. I like the focusing capability and the smaller body design. But if I was going to a photo situation where I needed to handle many different subjects and I didn't know exactly what I might need to shoot, or if I just wanted something that could do everything it might ever come across, the Nikon Z8 might be a better choice for you. Now, I know that you don't want this video to end. You could happily listen to me for hours and hours and hours from the comfort of your own windless room, but it's crazy windy out here. I need to get going, but before I go, have you seen our Instagram and Twitter? If not, there's our handles. You can follow us there. We'd appreciate that. Have you seen our podcast or possibly listened to it on your favorite podcasting apps? If not, check it out, PetaPixel Podcast. We're coming out with new episodes every week. Otherwise, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, leave your comments below. Thank you guys so much, and we'll see you soon for more PetaPixel.